Working Cows Podcast, episode 339. This episode is brought to you by Ranch Right, LLC. This episode is also brought to you by Ranching.fyi.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. And this episode is brought to you by Ranching.fyi. You ever think to yourself, there has to be a different way to do this? Ever crave learning from someone who's not only been there, but who's been successful at the goals you have? Are you ready to push yourself and your business beyond the social norms and ranch better? Ranching.fyi was created for you. Ranching.fyi shares business building strategies, creative operating techniques, and personal growth principles that will transform your ranch. If you are a rancher who craves more wealth, more knowledge, and more achievement in your business, then you need to become a member of Ranching.fyi today. To receive access to not only our library of webinars, but also our brand new private podcast and upcoming masterclasses, go to ranching.fyi now. Very excited to be joined today by Jeff Mundell. Jeff is a ranch manager from California, and we're going to talk to him today about the Californio style of horsemanship. We've talked to Buck Brannaman about this before, but Jeff was the MC, or the announcer, if you will, for the Buckaroo Traditions Gathering, which recently took place in Winnemucca, Nevada. And just a great gathering and a great format for a competition. It's not about the time, it's about the score, and it's scored by judges. So it's more about the style and the slowness and the calmness with which you can approach these things. So really excited to have this conversation with Jeff today. Jeff, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
You bet.
I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I so much appreciate the history and some of the things that go into the and maybe we can start there with that conversation. The Californio style of horsemanship, it goes by a lot of names. And is there a name for it that you prefer, and why?
Yeah, I mostly hear it called Californio style horsemanship because it kind of was born during that time. Out of necessity, and when the Spaniards came to the coast and brought cattle, and then, you had a good conversation with Buck Brannaman about how that kind of evolved. And essentially there was kind of an interesting mashup between, the labor force that they could get on the old Spanish style of riding. And it was kind of a melting pot for horsemanship and, trying to keep wild herds together. It was a really interesting skill set that was built with the roping and the rawhide riatas and, all the really interesting styles of roping that you see today that we're trying to preserve with the gathering.
And that is the Buckaroo gathering that you're referring to, right?
Yeah. And Buckaroo, it's just a gringo, bastardization of the word Vaquero. So if you just turn it into Buckaroo, and it was Vaquero was the original term. And so once it went north into the Great Basin, the Vaquero and the Buckaroo's gringo kind of mashup, it became Buckaroo Traditions. And, essentially that's kind of where it's really thrived and lived. And they've held really well to the old ways of that moved up here from California to the Great Basin. And so it's a neat place to go and kind of support that. And we're talking about the Buckaroo gatherings or Buckaroo Traditions Gathering that was just held, that roping event you wanted to kind of talk about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, and sure, let's just dive in there and talk a little bit about that whole gathering and how it went and kind of what the future of it looks like. Can you tell me a little bit about the format of it?
Yeah. So there's kind of a little renaissance for ranch roping, and people are starting to get excited about ranch roping. And what the ranch roping is it's a longer rope. So you got 45 to 65 foot rope, and it, depending on what competition you go to, they can be synthetic ropes, or they can be braided rawhide riatas or twisted rawhide riatas. And it's an interesting sport because it's rewarding low stress stockmanship. And so depending on what competition that you go to, there's the Pro-Am, which the Brandemans put on, which is incredible. And it's a place where people just learning how to rope can get paired with somebody who does ranching for a living and uses a long rope every day. And so the way the Pro-Am works is they put these teams together where two non-pros can get teamed up with a pro. And the whole time they're out there learning how to ranch rope, which is a point system. And so the way that everything you do is under scrutiny by the judges. You have a panel of 3 judges, and they look at you like they're going to hire you on their ranch. And so the way that you communicate with your team, it's going to be a team of 3. The way that you set up a shot, there's a thing called the roe deer. And the roe deer, for people that don't know, is essentially just a Spanish word for gathering. And most of the work done out in big landscapes are done out of a roe deer, which is you just gather cattle together. If you have a fence corner, you're good. That'll work. You can just hold them up there. Or if you have a place where you can hold them up by water, you essentially just put large groups of cattle together in a roe deer. And that low stress stockmanship is just working with the natural instincts of cattle. Cattle are a herding animal. They feel comfortable in a herd. And so if you can use that to your advantage, you put them in a herd, and then essentially you just let them be together and make that sacred ground. So when a rider goes into that roe deer, they'll sort a calf off or a cow off, whatever they're going to do, and they'll bring it out of that roe deer very quietly. No running in the roe deer, no trotting in the roe deer. You're not allowed to do anything in that roe deer but sneak through that roe deer, find your animal, and bring it out. That's essentially the old style of handling cattle that's been lost. A lot of ram and jam, a lot of timed events. And so we're bringing back these events like the gathering that just happened in Winnemucca, which is the Buckaroo Traditions Gathering. And so the way that works, like the Pro-Am, is it's a point system. And you get really lost in the nuance of ranch roping. So a rider will go into the roe deer. And if they crash that roe deer and scatter it across the chalk line that's in the arena, they'll get deducted points. And if that roe deer gets shook up and those judges don't like the way they're getting through that roe deer and they're just handling them rough or being rough, they just start docking points off of them. And then depending on the competition, you can, get added points. So if you throw a loop that hangs in the air and turns over its spoke and falls down on the animal, that's additional points, more so than, say, just a regular overhand shot. And so you get this point system that starts to build up. Anything that hangs on the hip for a heel shot's extra points. If you trip, so you pick up a hind leg and you have your header stretched tight, that header can throw a slack down in front of that animal, and it can step over that slack, and then you can pick up the other front leg on that animal, and that'll get you extra points. So if you lay that animal down without having to get the ground crew to go down and wrestle with them. So all these things in terms of efficiency and stock handling get scrutinized. The way you handle your horse, if your horse's head's up in the air and he's really uncomfortable and everything's not working right, or he's having a hard time and you're not sliding your rope across your saddle horn, which is wrapped in mule hide, those are all things that are part of this big loop style of roping that are under scrutiny all the time. And what's really fun about it is it raises everybody's skill sets around you. And so the Buckaroo Traditions Gathering was a really good display of really, really good teams who they don't have non-pros essentially. So they were essentially all people who kind of do it for a living. And to showcase that in Winnemucca was really fun because it'll give the non-pro riders at the Pro-Am this display to work towards. And so you're always trying to raise your skill set so that you can go to places like Winnemucca and you're up against people who do it all the time. And I lasted till the preliminaries and then I was out of it and I roped in it. And it was just, these guys just breathe it every day. And it's really fun to go to because it makes you look at all the little things like setting up a shot, how you work that animal out of the roe deer. There's just a lot to it that that seems to be lost in our fast-paced world that we're trying to bring back and celebrate. And essentially that's what it is.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I want to be at the next one.
Yeah, and it's really inclusive, and a lot of people are intimidated when they come because they see, like in Winnemucca, you had to get an 18-foot loop, which means you got 9 foot of rope on each side of your hand. When you stretch that loop out, they set it on the fence and then they put a piece of tape on it, and it's a big loop style of roping. So you can go and rope with a small loop. And my friends in Texas, they're tied on hard and fast, and they don't have anything but a 35-foot loop, and they are wizards with a rope. Mm-hmm. I mean, you get around them and they are phenomenal ropers. All this is just a different style that was developed in this region. And so we celebrate it with trying not to change that style of roping. So it's built on the big loop. So we start to learn how to handle the big loop. And so it takes quite a bit of finesse, and it takes really good timing and really good delivery to handle your slack when you have an 18-foot or 20-foot loop. And so it really kind of takes a little different set of skills than running a really nice horse right up there to one and roping it, because you're going to be doing these shots with a lot of distance. And so you get judged. So if you have an 18-foot loop, your horse might not even step. He might be standing still, and 20 foot away, that calf's bouncing across the arena with a header taking it across the arena, and they just send that rope over, and it just lays across them in a way that picks up those heels. And it's a really beautiful way of roping that we're trying to honor, because it does take a lot less stress to do it that way. And granted, you're going to rope with whoever or however you're around, wherever you're at, but when in Rome, we're in Elko, or we're in Nevada. So that's what they want to do. And it's a really fun art form to learn.
And I think that a lot of these, as you mentioned, a lot of these things are regional. Yeah. And a lot of the styles are in some ways determined by the landscape of the region. Like, for example, tying on hard and fast in Texas, part of that's about a lot of brush that they're dealing with in Texas. And one individual told me one time, I'm from Texas, so when I rope something, I intend to keep it.
No, that's right. And I mean, you look at the country, and it's so fun to watch them, just change up to fit the country. And, all that country, those guys that are in, you see them all over, and they're tied on hard and fast for a reason. And, if you're doctoring on wheat fields or whatever, it seems just really efficient. If you got a doctor, a whole bunch of them, there's a lot to be done there. And so that one guy can run out there and just run down his rope and get to something and get it tied down and get it doctored. And it's just an interesting way to go where, it just fits the region. I'm watching a lot of guys with small ropes tied on, and it's because they got to bring stuff down out of the rocks real steep, and so they keep those animals real short, and they neck them right to their foot, and then they keep them close, and somebody behind them hazes them down the country to get them out of there. And it's all beautiful, and it's all fun. And it's, just the different art forms and the ways that they can handle cattle in really rough country, because, let's face it, that's where you have to run cattle, and the good country with the high soils ends up going under the plow. And so we get cows up on country that you better learn how to manage them in places that are kind of tough,
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned this is happening in a roe deer. What is the actual infrastructure of the venue? So I'll just tell a brief story to kind of set some context for this question. I remember listening to a conversation one time about the history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and this might not sound related, but it is, because they said the purest way to actually test these fighting styles would be to do it in a field with no boundaries, right? But that's not practical or much fun to watch. And so they put them in a cage, and so, again, that's similar to what they're doing there is, to do this as they did it in the old days would be to just surround them in a roe deer.
That's right.
Out in a pasture with no panels or anything, no trailers for miles. And so what is the actual infrastructure of the event as it happened here a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, this one was set up at the Buckaroo Traditions Gathering. It was set up in the event center of the arena. And so what they'll do is they'll drop in 30 head of yearlings, and then they put them on one side, and then about 60 to 80 feet away, they'll put a chalk line down that represents your roe deer line. So if anything runs past that, you've essentially lost your roe deer. So, but a lot of places outside in real life, like if you go to the Bence's horse sale, they do a branding, and they do a branding out of the roe deer to showcase those horses that they're selling. And so they try to get it as close to practical as possible, because when you see horses out doing the actual job, you can get a good judgment of how they're going to be. There's a lot of horses that do great in an arena, but you go outside to do stuff, it's hard to make that decision. And so essentially, just to be able to convey what we're trying to do, we went into the indoor arena. There's not a lot of wind there. It's got a good sound system. And then we can kind of explain to people what we're trying to do and what they're watching. So it's kind of a spotlight of the old ways, and old ways being they're still the way that they do it. There's right. Places in Eastern Oregon and in Nevada where they'll put a roe deer together of a couple thousand head, and you're just out there for a week, and you got one rider that goes in, and they might be running in common, and they'll just pick out their brand. So one person will ride in there to rep that brand, and they'll pull all their branded cattle out, and they'll send it one way. It's a beautiful sight. And then the next person will come in and pick all their cattle out. There might be 4 or 5 different brands in there, and they just build what's called the Prada, which is a little bunch outside the roe deer, which is the cut. And so they'll sort those cattle off, build the Prada. And then as soon as they get their Prada built, the family will drift off and take those cattle to their summer ground or to another allotment. And then it's the same kind of situation, where the next person just starts building their Prada, and then they take their cut up to their allotment or take them home or wherever they're headed, depending on the time of year. And so it's a beautiful thing to watch. It builds community. It's really neat to function out of a roe deer because those cattle are calm and relaxed. And if those cows do it enough, they know where to go. You can stand right in the middle of 1,000 head and look at the one you want. She'll just pick her head up and walk right out of there and go right where she's supposed to go. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. Not a lot of ramming and jamming. Everything's calm and relaxed. And then at the end of the day, they go have dinner together and go back to their camps. And it's a really neat way of pastoralism and moving through the world that I want to try to shed light on and protect and preserve, because I think we need that more than ever, really.
Yeah, no, that is great. So in that context, are they generally running yearlings or dry cows, or are they bringing pairs out that way?
Yep. There'll be pairs. Most of the ones I've seen have been pairs. And so they'll bring out pairs, and then, they'll get branded up and go into run on common, usually in April or so, a little past that. And then they'll sort off, because they can only be on that permit for a couple, depending on 90 days or whatever they got. And then at the end of that, they got to pick up and go somewhere else. And so they'll pull their cattle off and pair off and then go that way. And it's really, really fun to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah. And I grew up, my dad was really good in the corral, and taught me a lot of really good lessons. And even out in the pasture taught me a lot of really good lessons. But I remember when we first started hearing about some of this low stress stockmanship stuff, and guys like even Trey Patterson at the Padlock Ranch talking about the fact that they really try to move, herds of 1,000+ pairs without having the calf separated from the mother as much as possible, and that was like one of the first mind-blowing things I heard with regard to stockmanship. And here you're saying, we've got multiple brands together, and you ride in there and you're sorting pairs, and you look at her, she understands what's going on, and she's picking up her calf and taking it with her.
Yeah, and her calf can be on the other side of the roe deer, and she'll just start to leave, and she'll grunt to that calf, and that calf will just circle around. And they'll meet on the backside of it, and then just pick up and go somewhere. And if not, the roe deer's sacred, so they just turn around and ride back in there until you get them together. And then once they're together, you just ease them out, and you just take your watch and throw it away, and you're just time stands still, and you just do this really beautiful work that's got there was no fences up on Mosquito Flat where we went, and right outside of Burns, and it was just on this really neat flat area, and those cattle could go get a drink, and they just spent all day out there, and then you just do it again, throw them all back together again the next day if you didn't get them all, and the next guy goes in and gets his brand out, and it's really interesting, and it's a neat way to do it, and it doesn't take a lot of horsepower, and I think a lot of people are horsed up for this stuff more than they need to be. They were just riding horses that were gentle and quiet. That's really the secret to the roe deer is you could just got to have that Dobbins from the backyard to just have to sleep and walk in there and do your sorting and then, walk out nice and quiet. It doesn't have to be a bunch of ramming and jamming. And after seeing it, it's really neat to watch because everybody's on the same page. And so that's what's neat about the gathering is everybody that went there really honored the roe deer. And the judges were, we had Dave Stoddard, Dave Weaver, and Ed Robertson, who are phenomenal hands who run on lots of big outfits in the Great Basin. Dave Weaver's been all over the place, and he used to put on the Californios roping when it was going in Red Bluff, and they moved it to Reno. And then it was just a lot of work to put on that show. But now he came to judge it. And then Dave Stoddard, he's in Eastern Oregon out by A-Rock, and they just live with their cows. I mean, they're incredible stockmen, and they hold true to the rawhide riata. They'll have 60-foot of rawhide riata, and that's the only rope they know. And it's really fun to watch them. And so being judged by guys like that, it really kind of makes you think differently. It's like, how am I going to go and hear them? If that calf hits the end of the rope and you're dallied off too tight and that calf hits the end of the rope, just accidentally flops over on its side, you're getting dock points because you can slide that rope. So if that calf hits the end of that rope and you haven't opened your hand and let it run, then it's pretty much a lack of stockmanship. And so there's just things like that start to add up on this thing that you start to really appreciate. You're like, oh, shoot, well, that's how we normally do it at home. It's like, well, you don't have to. You can open your hand and run rope, and everything's really under scrutiny. And I just hear Dave Weaver's voice in my head the whole time I'm in there. I'm like, oh, no. Yeah, it's really fun. But
yeah, no, for sure. Was there opportunity to get feedback then?
Yeah, it's really fun because I was announcing it too. So I got to hear a lot of really interesting feedback in terms of, what the judges want to see, and like when you go into the roe deer in California, it's pretty standard that you're roping in a corral. And so in California, they're big calves because they're born in the fall, and then you're roping big calves when the weather gets good. So that could be, February, March sometimes. I mean, it can be a big calf. And so depending on when you can get in those corrals and get gathered after the rains, you're going to have a big calf. And so it's always been a head and heel branding because it's easier to handle big cattle with a head loop on them. And so knowing that, with the head and heel brandings out of in a corral, you can rope something from far away, but people have a tendency to go to the corner of the corral and get short. And that gives their healer a little more of a handle. So the shorter you are, closer you are to that animal, and you take your dallies, you can give your healer a little better handle across the corral. Well, in Nevada and in the Great Basin, they don't really get short. And so if you rope something out of the roe deer, you're outside, you're not in really a place where you can get short. You're not going to go cram them up into a corner. So if you're outside, you rope it with 50-foot of rope, and you might have 30 to 40 foot out there, and then you just take it out. So you don't go back into the roe deer. So you might be headed out at a trot with a really long line. So you might have 40 or 50 foot of rope back there behind you, and that calf's coming out of there. And that's where your big loop ropers come in handy, because once that calf decides to go somewhere, you got a big loop that can come out and come around there and catch it out of the air. And it's really neat to watch. So you don't really get short. I mean, if there's a chance to, and they're running in front of you back to the herd, you can get short, but that's not really a big deal. So they can take them long and leave them long, which is interesting. And that's pretty different than when I was raised here in California. Everybody would go to the corner of the corral and get short and then go diagonally across the pen or however they had it set up. And in California, when I was a kid, they would strip the calves off the cows for Brandon, and they didn't do a lot of roe deer roping. Where once I moved to the Great Basin, everybody just threw their cows and calves together and just went in there and roped and brought it to the fire. And it was really interesting because it was a lot bigger traps, a lot bigger country to be in. And those cows just kind of knew the drill. They all went together and they brought their calves out. And some of them cows would come to the fire with their calf and might push you off her calf a couple times, but then, you get a brand on her, get her ear tag. But it's kind of interesting how different it is regionally.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's a lot of benefits to that. There's no offense to anybody from that region, but one time I told somebody, I said, I saw a study out of Oregon State that said that branding calves with their mothers at side was the lowest stress way to do it. And the response of the person I told that to said, yeah, that sounds like something that would come out of Oregon State, which I believe it's true. I just thought it was funny that was their response.
Yeah, and it really all depends on who. I've
Right.
seen really bad roe deer Brandons and really, really bad, all of that stuff. So it just really is such a different place, or different deal depending on where you're roping.
Right.
But yeah, I've seen really good roe deer brandings, and we do one here in the spring because we calve these cattle right about now, and so they'll be ready to rope in May or April, depending on where we land our cabin. But yeah, it's just, and so we do a roe deer branding here, and we just set our fires up away from the roe deer quite a little ways and that roe deer essentially is on a back fence, a pretty good panel fence, and then people ride in. And the etiquette of it is you have riders who hold the roe deer, and so they're outside holding the roe deer, and all they do is just anytime that roe deer starts to move or break away, they just kind of put those cattle back where they're nice and content. And the etiquette of it is someone will go in to rope. And so whoever they ride by who's holding that roe deer, they'll usually rope something and come out by whoever's holding that roe deer. And then that person's going to be the healer. And so they just roll around and they fall into a healer position. And then from there, they go to the fire. And then somebody moves over and holds that roe deer space. And then the etiquette of it is once you've gone to the fire and you're going back to the herd, whoever's holding roe deer, you stop and you take their spot and say, go rope one. And it's such a laid back thing. Nobody's trying to get their rope off. I've been to Brandon's where it was like a competition for everybody to get their rope off. And they're like, hey, settle down, guys. And then, we just hang out there, and then we walk up to whoever's holding roe deer and like, go rope one. And then they'll go in there and they'll say, let's set up a shot, or they'll, say, I'm going to bring this little brockle face out to you and catch it while you're holding roe deer. Cause that person could be on the outside and have a really good shot because that calf could be behind a cow, and it's just a game of angles. And so wherever that calf is, there's a shot for it in the arsenal ranch roping, and in the old Vaquero style. And that's kind of how it was built, and so from hula hands to backhand swings to turnovers to Johnny Brockers, there's so many different loops in your arsenal to be able to utilize to take advantage of the position that the calf is in without having to run to it, without having to get that calf shook up or bury it deep into the herd. And so while that calf's got its head poked out of the herd, you can just walk up there within, 40, 50 feet of it and send your rope out there and get it snagged off the outside and then just head to the fire with it. And so it's a really fun way to do it. And when it's done right, it's one of the prettiest things you'll ever see. There's just a wood fire crackling in the background and people laughing. There's just nothing else going on. It's not a bunch of ramming and jamming. You don't hear panels clanking or somebody panicking about something,
No propane torch going.
Yeah, sometimes. It just depends on where you're at. But yeah, I like a wood fire.
Right.
It's
well, it's
easier
always
to kind of hang out.
Always amazing to me how quiet it is once they shut the propane torch off. It's like, oh, I didn't realize it was that loud.
It's been in your ears all day long. Yeah, or the generator running the electric cord.
I go to two brandings right now that run a generator and electric cord.
You get used to it, but when you're around a wood fire, you're like, oh, that's nice.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
actually never branded at a wood fire branding, so there's only one that I know of around here.
Oh, where's that?
Well, there's only one that I know of around here, and it's actually just over into Wyoming. So
yeah, yeah. There's probably a lot of it kind of close by though, but it seems like a lot of that country, the wind blows, and the only time it stops blowing is just to change directions, and so it's one of those things where that's the basin, and so that's why the rawhide riatas work really well, because it can be blowing and going, and those things have enough weight to them to get there when you throw them. Where you can take a synthetic rope and throw it as hard as you want, it just kind of blows away in the wind, which happens, So yeah, that's one of the advantages of the heft of a rawhide riata, but it takes a little care. It's not a rope that you can, you run to the end of that with something heavy and stop it hard. It could snap your riata. So running that, letting your coils or your dallies run across your saddle horn is really important. And you pretty much it's like fishing for mackerel, it's just, you use it like a clutch. And if you need a little more, friction, you just put another dally on as it's running through your hand. And then pretty soon that's down to a stop. And a lot of people maybe don't know that, but yeah, you wrap your saddle horn in leather or shap hide, and that gives it just enough stick to kind of slow your rope, but you want your rope to slide pretty often and always. And that seems to be kind of the nature of a rawhide riata, is it's on the move all the time. And so you're popping dallies or you're running dallies. And so you're kind of just running your horn pretty standard. I mean, it's pretty standard. Just let rope always be kind of moving through it, which is really fun. And, I've got a lot to learn, but I love getting around these guys. They're incredible at it. And it's just like a third hand to them, it's really fun to watch.
Yeah. My first, whatever you want to say, whatever you want to call it, Vaquero style saddle is being made right now by a friend of mine. So
nice.
Pretty excited to get that here at the end of the year, I think. So he does it in the winter just for something to do when it's dark for a lot of the year and it's cold outside and chores are done for the day. He goes into his basement and cranks out saddles and I got on his list for this year. So let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Ranch Right LLC.
Does a year's worth of tax prep stand between you and being able to send things to your accountant? Are you tired of email after email asking for documents that you don't know how to find? Are you wondering exactly how much money you're going to owe the IRS this year and have no clue how to even start to figure that out? We've been there, but you don't have to. Hire Ranch Right today and know where your business stands. After all, taxes are a part of life, but Ranch Right helps you with data entry, bookkeeping, gives you reports that you can make sense of, and helps with a realistic outlook of what your business needs this tax season. Visit www.ranchright.llc today and cross tax prep off your list.
I went to a branding with a roping style saddle for a while. For the first year I was here, where I pastor a church here in western South Dakota, and that means I go to 2 or 3 brandings a week for about 60 days in the spring. And for the first season of branding out here, I just hadn't gotten around to putting anything on my horn, and I was roping with just basically a slick horn. And I found out all you really need to do is just take a couple extra wraps and it'll work. Yeah. And you can slide rope. But everybody was pretty sure that I was going to, something terrible was going to happen because I didn't have any rubber on my horn.
Yeah. And depending on where you're at, it's really interesting. I'll go to places that they look at you like you just landed from the moon, when you show up there with mule hide on, and you're like, we can rope. Like, we just got to dally a little bit more, and it's just different. People aren't used to seeing it. And then once they see it and it's really efficient, then they go, there's no other way to do it, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Everybody gets it done. But if you fall in love with the nuance of it, it gets really fun. But, you'd send me to Texas, I'm going with a small loop and I'm going to do whatever they're doing because they're wizards at it. And I'm not going to pretend to even, come there with my long rope and throw big loops there. But it's, because that's where they've refined it down. And those guys are so ropey down there. You could show them how to do something with a long rope, and in 5 minutes, they'd be out roping me. So I'm like, hey, settle down, guys. So it's kind of fun. But yeah, it's just regional. And I like the big loop style. I like, I like being able to handle big, heavy cattle that way and really try to learn the finesse, because it requires more from me as a stockman and a horseman to try to set everything up to work, so I'm not setting my horse in a position to get pulled off his feet. Like, they had a cow rope in there at the Buckaroo Traditions. And it was, these were 1,600 pound cows, and they bring them out and just lay them down and showcased how that was done. And, there's a way to do it, but those girls are, they're pulling that rope. They're not just kind of sitting there. They weren't pets, and these were straight off a sea punch, and they were, right off the desert, and the right kind of cattle to let if your rope's strong enough, and so we had a couple guys break a couple riatas and a Honda come off one, I think. But yeah, it's just, it's neat to see it in action with big animals, because you can lay a really big animal down really, really relaxed if you can handle your rope right, and it's really fun to watch, and it's easier on the horses, and you can do it over and over again because you're all running rope. So anytime that horse starts to get pulled off its feet, you just open your hand and he gets right back underneath him. So he doesn't ever know he can't pull anything, because the minute it gets to be too much, you just let your hand open and just run rope, and then you can get short and reset again to get the advantage on the animal. And that's really what's kind of fun about it.
Yeah. Yep. No, I've had an opportunity to do a little bit of that, and it is incredibly fun. Really enjoy it.
Well, and it seems really, I think it's really relevant today. Speaking about regenerative ag, and you're doing incredible work and bringing a lot of people out to talk about, the way the future ranching is maybe going to look. And so I see a big need for large herds of cattle throughout California, because essentially we're just islands. And if you think about, kind California, every ranch is essentially just an isolated island. And so this place, the Gabilan Ranch, 11,500 acres, but it's surrounded by freeways down below, cities down below. And so when it comes to wildlife connectivity, the mountain lions that are in Santa Cruz they're inbreeding now because they can't leave that island. So they're blocked in by highways. And it's a lot of the same thing for all the other wildlife. So they're all locked into these big landscapes, but they can't move freely back and forth. And so I see, California ranchers starting to work together to try to rectify that. What that means is building wildlife corridors, but those wildlife corridors are going to have to be maintained by domestic livestock. And it's going to take putting big herds together and moving them back and forth through a lot of different places, because California, let's face it, has been managed in a way that its fire fuel load is excessive. And they're throwing a lot of money right now to do prescribed burns, which, that's great. We're a fire ecology, but we can do a lot with livestock that won't release that back into the atmosphere. And we can trample a lot of invasive grasses. A lot of people don't know that, but California is essentially just overrun by introduced annual grasses. And so our perennial grasses can't thrive. A lot of it's been farmed out over the years or grazed out through the colonization of California. And so we've lost a lot of really special plant communities that we can start to bring back, and we can do it with large herds of domestic livestock because we can put those cattle pretty nimbly and prescriptively through an area. You're going to have to weave cattle through Teslas. You're going to have to move them through places up for the periphery of a city. And you're going to have to do things that are really different than a lot of people that don't manage cattle in a place where you're surrounded by cities. And so, but there's these huge places that need corridors. And I see this roe deer style of moving cattle and moving people around the landscape that could be really beautiful in a California context, because we could put big herds and move them places where there aren't fences, where there aren't infrastructure. So we could essentially put up a night pen of electric fence, and we could slow drift with people a herd of cattle into that area. We could do fire fuel reduction or vegetation management or whatever the resource concerns are. And then we just put those cattle to bed at night. And it could be a really communal way of moving through a landscape that doesn't have any infrastructure, And so I think it'll be, and that's kind of what I really like about this style of stockmanship and horsemanship, and is it takes people horseback, because you got to be able to get around these cattle quickly and get them shaped back up and put where you want to go. And then you need to be able to, essentially have cattle that are relaxed. And that's something that this style of horsemanship and big loop roping really kind of offers. And then just living with cattle again, being with cattle and moving cattle around. And then there's people here who have horses who have, just want to do something with them. And so places like the California Bridle Horse Association, which is a non-for-profit, is starting to bring people in that just to start to learn this style of stockmanship and horsemanship. And it's a great place to start. And then people from all walks of life can go in there and learn how to manage their horses in this way. And then maybe eventually graduate up into essentially the care of the herd. So they get to go out into the herd, so to speak, and they get to go participate in these grazing projects and fire fuel reduction and all the things that would be really neat. So these are just things that I daydream about using this style of riding and roping that I think would be really handy in the future.
Yeah, because prescribed burning is just the ecological equivalent of redistributing wealth. In 5 years, we're going to be back to where we were. It's all going to come back.
And every fireman will tell you that. They'll come and they'll do a burn and they'll say, well, what's the next step? Because they get an initial attack payment. So they get grant funding that gives them an initial vegetation management plan. And they can come in and do a prescribed burn. Well, there's nothing in place for 5 years later. And if you burn this country in 5 years, you will be brushed up, if not thicker than you did before you burned it, because it loves fire. And so you have to have a constant tool into terms of trampling to go through that. And it has to be something that's pushed into those areas, whether it be helicopter, a stack of hay in there or something. And we've done all the things you can think of on this ranch to showcase that. So you can put a dozer road into a chaparral line, and then you can throw hay on top of that chaparral, and those cattle will knock it down and they'll impact it in a way that thins it out. And the idea is not to, there's always this thing about cattle being a hammer, and everything's a nail. But the reality is, I love California. I love it so much. And you'll hear a lot of people have problems with California, but I love how diverse it is. And biodiversity is, really important to me. And so wildlife is really important to me. And there's too many tracts of land here that are undisturbed, or, in a way that Henry Coast State Park is a really good example. It's just been locked out of grazing. And so then you lose all your, checker spot butterflies and all the things that rely on being able to move through a grassland that isn't thatched, that is robust. These California native species need that herd effect in order to thrive. And so that science is pretty well done. And so now we need to figure out how to build out really good grazing plans to create disturbances. And California essentially just needs these mosaics of disturbance. And, a lot of people look at the beef industry because everything's funded with beef dollars. But my goal is to try to funnel dollars from other places that want to see this thing happen, whether it's condors, whether it's, migration corridors, whether it's invasive plant, being pushed back. We need to be able to figure out how to capture funding from different sources, because let's face it, California taxes are so high that, you're not going to make ranching work really well on cow dollars alone. And so, it's not suited well for it. And essentially it's stalker country. You got a real small window of nutrition to make a fat animal in California, and then you better ship that animal somewhere else. But we need hooves and mouths on this landscape to keep it vibrant. So that's why we're a cow-calf. It's essentially to meet our ecological goals, because we got to keep pushing that grass back. And so it's been interesting to try to find that sweet spot. And, long-term for California, I think that is maybe a product that we could package up as ranchers and offer.
Yeah. And Glenn Elzinga was the one that I think reintroduced that to a broader audience.
He's living it.
Right. Yeah. That in-herding, he calls it in-herding. Did that ever die in places like the Great Basin? Was it always there?
I think it's always kind of been there, but what's happened is, it's a labor issue now. The labor dollars are too high. And so they'll spread those cattle out, and they're not bunched. They're not really living with them. They spend a lot of time kicking them out, getting them branded, and then trying to get them back together and back home on those big landscapes. But it would be an interesting way to do it. To see if you could showcase it. Glenn is the only one I know who's really living it and doing it. And it seems to be working well for him. I mean, you see those girls come off the mountain pretty wrung out at the end of the season, but who wouldn't, Right. But it sounds like they're good about, rotating them out and saying, when somebody's teeth starts gritting too hard, they take them to town and let them do their laundry and stuff. So it works out. There's ways to do it, and they're going to be the ones that set the framework of it, and can, they're going through all the experimentation of it right now. So hats off to Glenn and that crew. They're incredible.
Yeah. I just confirmed that I'll be emceeing the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition conference in January, and Glenn is one of the speakers there, and I'm really looking forward to being there to hear him live and hopefully get him cornered with a recording device and talk to him again. So really appreciate him. So yeah, very good stuff. One of the things that came up early on, I took some notes, but we haven't had a lot of time to cover those. So that's been good. That's always a good sign when I take a bunch of notes and I don't use them. So anyways, but one of the things that kind of I wrote down early on is back to this Buckaroo Traditions Gathering, that the importance of one of the distinctives of that gathering is the scoring versus timing. Like, we're not timing you, we're scoring you. Talk about the importance of that.
Yeah, that's really important. You got a 10-minute, I think, time limit just so we can keep things moving along. Most people get it done way before that, but it goes back to slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And so it's just one of those things where it's not a timed issue. And when you brand calves and get together as a community, it's one of the funnest times of the year. And so why turn it into a speed event? That doesn't make any sense. And so we need to turn it into ceremony. We need to turn it into a celebration and communal work. And so if we can continue to do that and throw that watch away, and then we can get into watching a chess match, and then it's a matter of, I've been watching this team go and they're 3 points behind this team, but if they do a trip on this next loop, they're going to be winning this event. So there's all these little things that you start to watch over the day where you go, oh, or if you watch somebody who say is in a mixed rope branding, they're going to get extra points for a rawhide riata. So you'll have 3 guys walk in with rawhide riatas and they'll just get extra points just for having those. Or if you're riding straight up in the spade bit, or in the 2-rein with a spade bit, if anybody has a spade bit in their horse's mouth, they're getting extra points, because that's something that we're trying to bring back and showcase that it's very relevant and an incredible way to train horses. And so essentially just, getting those rewards out there and trying to showcase that it's not about time. It's not about time at all. And so that's kind of what we're fighting against. Because once you start putting time in there, you start bending panels, you start, everybody knows the workaround. Well, I'm running out of time. They speed things up, blow the roe deer. They lose 2 points, but they know they can get a trip on the backside of it. So everything starts to get really fast because they know they can make up those 2 points for blowing a roe deer on the backside. So then time starts pushing on people. And so we're always trying to fight against that to where we don't need it to be that way. It needs to be calm and relaxed, and we need to be rewarded for that. And the prizes that these people give out are incredible. They bring the best craftsmen out of the sagebrush that you'll ever know. And, they'll just come out with twisted hair on their arm, or they'll have, spade bits that they've been pushing on in their shed out back. And, they know all these really good craftsmen that keep these traditions alive, and they just call them on the phone and, tell them to come to town with all their wares. And they do. Then people show up and they do what they can to support these things, because it is really important, and it's much more than just going to town. And what's neat about it is it's not, it'll humble you really quickly. So the minute you think you're going to show up and win a bunch of stuff, it's so judged with flow that if you walk in there with your nerves, the cattle feel it, everything feels it, everything reacts to it, and you've already lost points. And so you have to walk in there with a poker face, and you move slow and easy, and you set up shots in ways that, because those cattle, especially at Winnemucca, Scott and them brought those cattle in, and they were hot, and they were big, and you had 800-pound yearlings in there, and they hadn't been around people, hadn't been inside, and so they were real feely and really reactive, and so they were Scott's cattle, and so we needed to be real respectful of his cattle, because we all know what they're worth right now, and so he's going to go put those right on the feed bunk. So if we don't handle them right, we just not only lost the event, we just hurt our friend Scott, and maybe he won't put that event on again. So there's a lot weighing on it if we want to come to town and showcase these things.
Yeah. I'll tell you about a humbling experience I had one time at a branding. This guy pulls in late to a branding, at least what I perceived as late to a branding anyways. And he pulls in and he's driving either a Ford Excursion or a Chevy Suburban, pulling a 2-horse trailer, and unloads this horse and just rubs the dust off of it with his hand, throws his saddle blanket on, throws the saddle on. I wasn't paying too much attention to any of that. It just kind of like, that's kind of funny seeing a guy pull in with a Suburban and a 2-horse trailer and everything like that. And he proceeds to ride into the branding pen with a Wade Tree saddle and a riata, and throwing these huge loops, draping them over the back of the hips of the calves, and catching 2 feet and dragging them out. And I'm like, okay, never mind.
Yeah, they'll surprise you. Yeah. And that's how it was in Eastern Oregon. There'd be a kid just walk up next to me in a ball cap with his tennis shoes, he comes trotting over there, and he just shakes out a 20-foot loop and sends it right against the wind. I'm like, who is this kid? And he's just like, oh, shucks. I'm like, oh, man.
Yeah,
so
the funny thing about it is he grew up in farm country. And so I cornered him after the branding, and I said, so where does a kid that grew up in farm country learn to rope like that? And he said, my brother and I got turned on to it, and we just decided that's how we wanted to learn to rope. So that's what we did.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, well, the 310 guys are out there, and it's the Daltons, or Dalton Darnell and his brother, or his dad, John. And they're doing a lot of great work, really kind of open that country up for big roping. And, they've been coming out and getting into these competitions, and it's great to see, they're great. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Again, I really appreciate this conversation. One of the things,
I appreciate what you're doing. Yeah.
Another one of the things that I wrote down was one time Ariel Greenwood got me in trouble. We were talking about this, about maintaining stress level on cattle, and that being a better indication of success than how fast you could get something done. And somebody reproached us both thoroughly for playing into the PETA hand and taking their side in the argument or whatever the accusation was. I don't even remember at this point, but but that's what it's all about. It's all about being able to get it done with as little stress on every individual involved, from the cattle to the horse to the livestock to the people on the ground. Getting it done that way is, I think, undeniably better to me anyways. And I really appreciate people who take the time to consider it and learn it better.
Yeah, it's worth chasing. It's just something different. And it's, for me, I love the art form. I love that, the art of trying to handle cattle really quietly and lay them down. It's more challenging than not, and there's a lot of people that get hurt, and you can be in places. What's neat about this style of roping is you can go in with a pretty green horse. It doesn't have to be very handy, and you can work your rope and work your setups in a way that keeps that horse really confident, really secure. And I mean, it's just different. And I like that about it. But I've never seen broker horses in the Texas cow pony either. So whatever they're doing, if that means running out and tying off to a bathtub and going to the bar, they're getting them broke too. It's just different, so I don't know what it is, but they can get a horse really broke too. This is just a little more fun for me, and it's more regional. I mean, I got a lot of history in it, and I love the feel of a rawhide riata. And it's been a long time since I'd had one in my hand, because I broke mine quite a while back. And so I just finally got one at Winnemucca, and I've been playing with it and missing it, and it's just really fun to kind of try to keep those traditions alive. And I think they're really relevant. And I think, big picture thinking, I mean, we don't have anybody, doing a lot of rawhide work and doing, you don't see tanneries anywhere around here. And why not start getting that stuff back up and going? And why not start figuring out ways where we can, start moving with really neat gear. And there's people that, you get an old cow and you cut her up and you take her hide and you can make a rawhide riata, but that doesn't happen, but only on the ranches. So if people want to buy this stuff, rawhide riatas aren't cheap. They take a long time to make. And so it'd be neat to figure out ways to incorporate, that back into our history. And because it was born here in California, it's really special to me. And I think a lot of people in California don't even know about it. And I'm trying to get better at telling that story and bringing people from all walks of life into it. And, even you can say what you want about Yellowstone, but it's brought a lot of people into the Western world again, and they're looking at stuff. And, you hear stories of guys that have seen that show and went up to the arena and just wanted to buy everything in it, and so there's just people wanting to get back into this. But what a great place to absorb that kind of person into this style of horsemanship and start them off in that and keep these traditions alive is really neat. And I think it's worth doing. And I see, my long-term vision is, trying to move herds through this California landscapes that, we can start to do a lot of vegetation management throughout the state and just treat it like a big old ranch and, use cattle as a tool to what they're designed to do, just put them to work doing what they're supposed to do. And then I think we'd have a lot healthier and a much more vibrant ecosystem in terms of, what we can do to add value. So. Yeah.
No, I think you've done a great job today of pitching a really compelling vision of what that could look like, and I think that style of horsemanship and stockmanship specifically is an indispensable tool in getting that done because of the lack of infrastructure that it requires, really, to make it happen. Yeah. So.
Yeah, thinking about that, I mean, there's everywhere you go, like Henry Coast State Park, all the fences are on the ground, and so going in there with the herd's going to be. It's going to be exactly that. So, yeah,
for sure. Just as we wrap up this portion of the conversation, I would like to hear about some of the influences, maybe names that people don't know, or maybe names that people that are on the periphery, people that haven't necessarily had a documentary made about them. Buck Brannaman's great, and he's done a yeoman's work in getting this kind of style popularized in some ways, but I think there's other guys out there that are his contemporaries or that people have come up under him that are doing similar work. So are there other resources, other books, DVDs, YouTube channels that really have helped you throughout your journey?
Yeah. So I, all of Brannaman's work has been a huge influence on me. And you know about those, but there's a lot of people who are starting to teach it. Most of the best people you'll never know. And all these guys will tell you that. There's guys in the brush that just, they say one or two words a day, and they're incredible. Billy Askew is one of them. He is just a phenomenal hand. And so they just gave out legacy awards at the Traditions, and it was Billy Askew and Jim Pruitt, who are both been on the desert, and they're California raised, and they, kind of did what's called the circle, where you go and you get on the wagons and you go you go to Idaho, to Nevada, you go Utah, you just make a big circle all through the Great Basin and work the wagons. And that's essentially the circle that a lot of these guys will do. They'll go when they're young, they'll get on the wagons, and then they'll go do big brandings throughout the summer, live in teepees, and then, go out with a horse cabbie. And there's still places that do that. Right now, there's an A team in Nevada right now that just got parachuted in to put a really big ranch back together that they don't even know how many cattle they have. And these guys are getting skinny, and they're not sleeping very much, and their horses are pretty single gutted by now, but they're putting together a really big old ranch. And, so that's really neat to kind of know those guys, but you'll never really hear about them. But 310's doing a lot of really good work. If you look them up on YouTube, they've got a series of really good YouTube channels. And then, Bruce Sandifer is a California bridle horseman who has really held true to the old ways in a way that he's trying to teach it to people. He kind of came up through the thinking that it was just, his history kind of showcased that they were rawhide. Essentially you'll see people come up through the California style of horsemanship, and it's a lot of times it'll be snaffle bit, hackamore, two rein, and then straight up in the spade bit. But he's done a lot of research to kind of showcase that he wants to start just in the hackamore. So he goes just to the hackamore. He starts his horses purely in the hackamore and the rawhide. And so they won't see a bit in their mouth until they're 5-6 years old. And so it's a really long process to start a horse in the hackamore. And it's such an interesting, nuanced way of training a horse, because it's really balanced. Most horse training is pressure and release. And the old way is more of a balanced style riding. And so you can only pull a horse so much in a rawhide hackamore before they kind of numb up to it and go, no, we're not going to listen to this. And so it takes a different style of communication. That's the reason that they use the hair ropes on the hackamore, which is a twisted horsehair. And that twisted horsehair indicates or sends a message down the neck. Anytime you draw it up the neck, that horse needs to look into that. And so essentially you're not pulling them with a hackamore, as you're more of lifting off balance and then setting that balance back down. And it translates really well up into the bridle, because your hands are closed. You're not reaching out with your hands. Everything's right there in the middle of your spine. And so Bruce Sandifer is a really good one, who has the California Bridle Horse Association. He's a really good one to look for that balanced style of riding, which I'm chasing it. It's really fun to try to understand. Everything's really slight, always finding center, which is totally different than the way that I learned originally, which is a lot of pressure and release. Both are incredible, and you can make incredible horses with both styles. But I'm always just trying to learn something a little bit different, so you can kind of get lost down that rabbit hole too. So that's a fun one. And then Mark Black, he's out there, and he's a phenomenal roper. Who else? I mean, there's a ton of people out there doing it. You can just get on for like natural horsemanship clinics, and you can find a lot of people doing it. There's a lot of people who are doing clinics like Dwight Hill, Scott Grosskopf. Those are all guys. And Scott Grosskopf would probably be one for you, because he's in Montana, and he had the Northern Range Ranch Roping Association for a while. And I don't know if they're still going or not, but he would be one I would go to a clinic tomorrow if I could, because he is phenomenal big loop roper. And he did the circle too, went through the ZX and went through Nevada and Eastern Oregon, and ended up out in Montana, I think, where his family was from. But phenomenal ropers. Dwight Hill's incredible. Yeah. So that's just a few.
Very good. Really, that's cool. Good list. Got some notes here for future guests, hopefully, of the Working Cows podcast. So I'm always mining those resource lists for that kind of stuff. But Jeffrey, I really appreciate your time today. It's been fantastic.
Thanks for all you do.
Do you think that the Buckaroo Traditions Gathering is going to happen again? Was it a reviving of that this year, or had it has it been going for a number of years prior to 2023?
No, Andrea Van Leuven and Scott came up with the idea, and Andrea has been kicking it around a while. Finally, she pulled the trigger on it. And if anybody knows Andrea Van Leuven, it's going to happen again. So she's just a force to be reckoned with, and a person that really understands community and keeping culture intact. And it was really neat to work with her because, it's her ability to find the right people and put them in the right places, I think is going to bring a lot of, getting these grassland games going again is really important because, and if we can get the right sponsorships and the right people to understand what they're watching, it's a really fun gathering. And then after that, they had the Outside Circle show. So they brought an Outside Circle show is incredible. It's Justin Riker, and he gets a bunch of just bunkhouse. Anybody comes out of the bunkhouse with their guitar, and they all come to town, and they just start getting on the stage. And it is one of the funnest things, from cowboy poetry to anybody with a guitar. It's just, and Nicole Grady helps put it on. I mean, they're all partnered up. But that's the Outside Circle show. So it was a really neat deal because everybody could go rope at Winnemucca and then go right to the Winners Casino. And then right there in the Winners Casino was the Outside Circle show, and the music was flowing, and it was a beautiful setup. So it was just really good. And I think Andrea nailed it out of the park for the first time show. It was incredible. And I'm definitely thinking they'll be doing that again. So
right. Yeah. The website says 2024 TBD. So they're looking forward to it already, but I just didn't know how solid those plans were. But I think we can all look forward to that coming again, maybe towards the end of 2024, and hopefully, like you said, inspiring other people from around different regions to put on similar events. Because I totally agree. It's something we need to not just keep it alive, but also attract the next generation of people to that kind of work.
Well, and attaching people to where their food comes from. A lot of people, she reached out to everybody, from anybody that worked at the local smog tech place to the OBGYN for sponsorships, because they all are part of this process. And this beef feeds everybody. And so everybody's a part of this story, whether they think they aren't or not. And so the trouble with agriculture is we've put such a gap between us and the people that we feed. We got to pull them in. They got to see all the things. They need meat hanging in the storefronts again. We have to get people used to seeing all the things that we want to value and keep important, and showcase why, moving large herds across this landscape are important. And once you tell that story and get people to your events, they're all part of that story. We're there because of them. And so they're all part of this food shed, our watersheds, all the things that these cattle maintain and keep going. If we do things right, everybody can get re-immersed back into it, and so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's, I guess, last question for this portion. Were there spectators, people not there, didn't bring a horse, didn't bring a trailer?
Yeah, there was quite a few spectators. The bleachers were pretty full, and it's really fun. And I do my best as an announcer to kind of explain to people who haven't never seen anything like this what they're watching. And then, just the whole energy kind of carries them through it, because there's vendors right behind them. They can turn around and go shopping, and it can be a place where you get all your Christmas gifts and all the things that you get. And if you don't even own a horse, you can leave out of that place with a horse, a saddle, and tack. Somebody will sell you something to get you entered in this thing next year if you wanted to do it, or go to the Pro-Am, or go to the Californios. The California Bridle Horse Association puts on the Skills of the Rancho down at the V6. And so there's all these great little places where people can start to get into the community. And that's all it is. It's just, you're now part of this community and this tribe and this family. And so we're going to all reach down and help you wherever you're struggling and pull you through this thing.
Very good. Yeah. Jeff, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Clay. Appreciate you.
Next week on the Working Cows podcast, well, first of all, really appreciate Jeff and his perspective and just the way that he thinks about these kinds of things, and really looking forward to continuing to grow in the way that I approach stockmanship, especially when I'm on a horse. And so really appreciate that, and would love to be able to attend some of those events that he talked about, from the Brannaman Pro-Am to the next Buckaroo Traditions Gathering. Hopefully that takes place again next year, and would be a great opportunity to go and take that in. But next week, I think what we're going to do is kind of round out the year and talk a little bit about Christmas and a little bit about creation and some of those things. And looking forward to sharing that episode with you. And we will be back Christmas Day, Lord willing, with another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We will see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.